Hello, and welcome back to my second video. Some things to get out of the way. I obviously have changed things up a bit. I'm trying a few different things out. Gonna see how what setting I like the best. So far, this is feeling pretty comfy. I'm liking it. This chair is awesome. Can sit back like this, but I don't know if that's a good idea. It might look weird in the framing. I don't know, but I did upload a music video that's super cool. You should check it out. If you haven't watched it yet, totally do that. I'm going to be trying a few different things to try to figure out what style works best for me, what sort of things, look the best, vibe the best in terms of how I want to, produce these videos. But so far, I'm liking the vibes in the room. I'll probably add some stuff, to the sides here, like more studio-ish. Add some books, whatever, on the shelf, some plushies. Without any further ado, let's get into the topic of this video. I want this video to be a discussion about liberalism. I think that the core ideas of liberalism should be what we strive to establish in our country. So, in order to have this conversation, we must first talk about what even is liberalism anyway. It is a political and moral philosophy that spawned from the Enlightenment era. People started believing that reason, logic, and intellectualism, which we'll get more on that later, was the best way forward in terms of deriving our sciences, but they really wanted to direct this movement, not just for the sciences, but for politics and our way of life as well. They asked the question, what if people were able to come up with a system of governance that was able to address the concerns of the people it governed rather than just enforcing itself upon them? Could we use reason and logic to come up with better systems and better ways of life for ordinary people? After much debate, they came up with some core values that they believed would hold the key to a free and fair society governed by the people for the people. Admittedly, most of these ideals that we're going to be talking about in the context of this video are going to be seen through a modern worldview. At the time, they used a lot of these views to justify some pretty horrific things, like slavery and women not having equal rights. They believed there was an argument to be made that these people were innately different, which, for the record, they are not, and that is wrong. But we have the luxury of having modern philosophy to address the more problematic parts of these views and only keep around the ones that are really worth sticking to. Let's go through the list of ideals. The first view we're going to be talking about is rights of the individual. Every human has rights that, regardless of their objectivity, they themselves believe should always be respected and upheld if they live in a free and fair society. Even if you think that these rights aren't objectively there, you can acknowledge that people view themselves as having these rights, and so we should respect that, and the government shouldn't get involved or interfere with these rights. The next key point is consent of the governed. If we all agree that we need some structure, some sort of governmental body to oversee society to ensure things like rights, and we all agree that we have rights that need to be upheld, then it's up to the people to decide whether or not they're willing to give up some of those rights in order to secure the other rights. By definition, a government is going to have laws and rules that restrict certain people's ability to do things. So in order for the relationship between the government and the people to be symbiotic, to be something that's beneficial for both of them, then they have to come to an agreement. They have to consent to that government being made in order for it to be functional and fair and not be constantly subjected to tension between the people and the government. The next core value we're going to talk about is liberty. Now, people shouldn't be placed under restrictions by the government unless it's absolutely necessary to the security of the country or protecting society. Oppressive governments were all the rage back in the 18th century, and they were determined to avoid this at all costs. Political equality was another very large part of this core system. This was the first one that I think the Founding Fathers truly messed up on. They definitely didn't have the best take when it came to political equality, because in today's view, we can understand that everyone should have equal participation in the political environment. There should be no unbalanced influence, or processes, or treatment on the grounds of race, ethnicity, religion, or gender, etc. However, it would seem that the Founding Fathers didn't believe that to be the case. Next, we have equality before the law. Everyone should be equally protected under the rule of law. There should be no laws favoring one group over another. There should be no one afforded extra protection or lack of protection into written law. That means that the law shouldn't have anything that discriminates unequally across the different sects of society. This leads us into the next point, which is the rule of law. And the rule of law is really just the idea that the law applies to everyone and is absolute. There is no government official or party or individual or group that should be excluded from legal prosecution for a crime. They really believed that the one thing that should be absolute in the country is the written law. They obviously wrote in ways to challenge laws and to overturn laws and have a very lengthy process for how things become laws, but once it did, they wanted that to rule over all implementations of government. They didn't want the government to be able to rise above the law or the law not apply to the people in government. That was very important because they were so afraid of government rule. Now, this one's interesting because secularism has come to mean something totally different. It's quite a scary word to a lot of religious people in America. They view it as some sort of flawed, fundamentally broken system. They think that secularism is dangerous, and they think religiosity should be the default for a society. The reason why this is so important is that the government shouldn't have an established religion that it favors over any other, nor should it have a religion that it rules against. In order for all religions to be treated equally, the government should abstain themselves from making any sort of particular national faith. This helps prevent religious persecution by the government, but it also helps prevent interpersonal persecution because no one religion can say, hey, the government likes us more than you, so, we're more official. Everyone can practice their faith, knowing that the government won't look down on them for doing so. The last point that we're going to talk about that's very important is the idea of political and economic freedom. People should be able to exercise their personal political beliefs openly and without fear of retaliation from the government. They should be able to openly discuss their ideas and talk about people who they support and, more importantly, don't support without restraint. This applies to the economy as well. Individuals, which that's very important, shouldn't have their buying or selling powers limited or interfered with by the government. People should be free to do with as they please with their money. If I want to spend all my money on overpriced coffee and avocado toast, I would love to do that. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but these ideals, I think, truly encompass what liberalism stands for. They are the things that most people think of when you talk about liberalism. And in order to make sure that these ideas weren't forgotten or just lost to time, the Founding Fathers wanted them written down in the form of the Constitution. The reason why they wrote the Constitution was so that these ideals would be enshrined in the founding document of the country, so that no one could just flippantly overwrite all of the philosophical progress they made or rewrite history. This is why our government is usually considered constitutional. When you look at all of these points next to each other, it's clear that a democracy was the best way forward to ensure political freedom and liberty. They wanted people to always have a way to exercise their political freedom within the structures of the government. They were afraid of a direct democracy, however, because as with any political ideology, it does come with drawbacks. Yes, even democracy. They definitely were too restrictive at who would be involved in the democratic process at first pass, though. That much is very clear. It's important to our understanding to investigate exactly what they were afraid of, because it's obvious to me, at least, that we're starting to face some of those exact problems they feared, and we're trying to avoid. First, there comes the question of practicality. With a country as large as America, would it even make sense to get everyone involved in every budget approval, every single international policy decision, or every new road that needs built? I think it wouldn't be very smart. I mean, it's hard enough to get people to vote every 2 years in the congressional elections, let alone get people to vote almost every single day, which is what it would turn into if we had to vote on everything. Obviously, they went a little too far when it came to the separation between the government and public opinion. However, it's not beyond our reach to make those changes. For example, the 17th Amendment was added to the Constitution that would move Senate elections from a bureaucratic process to a vote that people would participate in. One of the biggest criticisms that the Founding Fathers had for a direct democracy was that it would succumb very easily to the whims of public opinion. Having a consistent, strong international policy is very important when it comes to the strength of a country. It's evident with how divisive things are today and how quickly things change in terms of the public view of them, but if we were involved as frequently as all the decisions are to be made, then our national policy wouldn't be very coherent. It would be constantly flipping between one side or the other. People wouldn't be able to have a good say in what our long-term politics would look like, it would be very chaotic and hard to follow. Another issue, which I personally believe had the right idea but just had a horribly bigoted implementation, was that the electorate needed to be properly educated in order to give the best outcome politically. If people are voting on things and they aren't very educated on them, then their vote isn't actually doing what we think it does. Let's say, for example, someone is trying to pass a law about whether certain books should be banned or not. I think we all agree that in general, books should almost never be banned. However, if a portion of the population has been convinced that this material contains very destructive information, and people are voting on low information about this topic, then although they are against the banning of books, they might be persuaded to vote for the banning of books because of a lack of information. Now, the Founding Fathers' solution to this problem wasn't to educate people or try to create a better system, it was just to cut out everyone who wasn't educated, which at the time was pretty much everyone who wasn't a rich white guy. So that was a big problem. This was one of the massive flaws in their political philosophy in terms of looking back on it today, but their idea of an educated electorate wasn't incorrect. That idea in and of itself is very good, and it should get us to question whether or not we have the systems in place necessary to educate people to have a well-informed democracy. There is a way, however, to start poking holes in this idea. For instance, is it even realistic to expect people to be sufficiently educated in all areas of politics at all times? After all, if we want to ensure political freedom, people should have the right to abstain themselves from politics and not vote on certain issues that they don't really want to. So if we can acknowledge that a direct democracy isn't a realistically viable option, and that people voting on issues should be well educated on them, and that we shouldn't really expect everyone to be well educated on said political topics, this is where the idea of people electing representatives to hold office in order to advocate for the ideas of their constituents comes from. This is why sometimes people call America a republic. But it isn't accurate to exclude the democracy part, because we do still hold a say in who gets to represent us. But it is a good idea to have someone that we can say, hey, I don't want to spend my entire life looking up political things and being interested in politics and talking about these ideas. I want to be able to point to someone and say, this person I largely agree with. I'm going to trust you to advocate for the things that I like. And if you stray too far and no longer start advocating for the things I like, I'm going to vote for someone else. And that, admittedly very simplistically, is how American democracy works. To give a holistic description of what America was founded to be, we are a constitutional democratic republic. This is American government, and this political philosophy is what the Constitution intends to establish. This leads us into the next section that we're going to talk about, which is the Bill of Rights. The first stress test of our newly founded constitutional government was to enshrine these ideas of liberalism into our Constitution. We had the structure of government down. We understood how we wanted it to work, but we didn't really have the rights and the things that we wanted to enshrine as protections for the citizens at this time. So the first big question was, what kind of rights are we going to grant the citizens and protect in the Constitution? I'm not going to go over every single amendment because that's A, a lot of time, and B, out of the scope of this video. Maybe perhaps we will one day go through all of them, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to include the ones that I think exude the most liberal energy. The First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This amendment basically just word for word adds the core values of liberalism into our Constitution. The first line ensures that the government remains secular in its practices. The next line prohibits the restriction of people to espouse their ideas to the public, and also prohibits them from interfering with the media, as well as protects people from being punished by the government for protesting. I don't feel I need to go into too much detail here. All I'll say is that I think it's clear why this amendment is the first one. The next one we're going to talk about is the Fifth Amendment. I think most people know the First and Fifth Amendments. I think that the three most people know is the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment. This is what gives most American citizens their pride in terms of their legal rights, their personal rights, and their ability to say the things that they want to. The Fifth Amendment reads, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." This amendment is very most oftenly recited in movies, in popular culture, and TV shows. I plead the fifth, very common phrase, and it goes to show how important the legal freedoms were to the Founding Fathers. Hell, pretty much all amendments 4 through 8 are just outlining the legal protections that citizens have in regards to the judicial system of America. That's where you have search and seizure, right to trial by jury, right to no self-incrimination, and so much more, just so that people would feel safe and secure knowing that the government couldn't just blindly prosecute them. The next one is a little less known and less popular, but it's the 10th Amendment, and this one reads, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." This one, although it's not as flashy as some of the other amendments, really solidified the idea that unless something is explicitly granted to the federal government, it should be reserved to the people and the states to decide. Basically, it was ensuring that the federal government would only be exactly what it was outlined to be, and it wouldn't be granted powers in some vague or mysterious way. The government would be nothing more than a strong, united body for ensuring the safety of the country as a whole and the protection of the rights of all of its citizens. So, we now have the Constitution that outlines our structure of government and why it is the way that it is, and we also have the idea of liberalism enshrined with the Bill of Rights. So, what do we take away from all of this? If I could condense the entire point of this video down to one sentence, it would be the method we use to create a system of government is vitally important to the success of that system of government. The reason why all of this seems so common sense to us now, and why the parts that are obviously bad seem so obviously bad, is because of how carefully thought out the ideas were, and the justifications given for why they believed those things. The more fleshed out these ideas are, and the more time we spend trying to justify them, the more chances we have to see whether or not these things should be respected and held in best regards by our society, or whether they should be thrown out and forgotten as bad ideas of the past. There was decades of political war fought on the grounds of ideas and protests and activism that focused people's attention on the ideas that should be talked about and brought up in the arena of politics. This method that I'm speaking about, and what I'm going to end the video on, is intellectualism. Now, pure intellectualism, which the Founding Fathers mostly believed in, does have its drawbacks. It advocates for the use of logic and reason, and only logic and reason, to arrive at the most correct position. It completely ignores the very human aspect of emotion and bias that is admittedly unavoidable. It's very obvious with studies in science that we can see that even people who are educated on these biases and these emotional problems aren't any better at avoiding them. So this is just an unavoidable fact of reality. But that doesn't mean we should ignore them or that it's pointless to investigate further into these biases and these ideas. Because the main part that I agree with intellectualism is that there is a most correct position. There is a correct political position on most topics. There is something that most people can agree to and would either benefit the most people or reduce the most harm in certain situations. The piece of the puzzle that we're missing here is that we can incorporate emotion and bias into our view of intellectualism to arrive at a synthesis view, one that uses primarily reason and logic to analyze these ideas, but acknowledges that we might be doing so from an emotional place. The reason why we're debating them so fervently is because it comes from an emotional place. And we can use that. It's okay. We can use that to fuel our investigation into these topics so that we know what's important, what things should be talked about, how to go about these issues. But we must accept that sometimes that means our emotions might be clouding our judgment. I'm going to choose a not so controversial topic, that way we can, sort of lightly go through this as a fun exercise. Abortion. Obviously, I'm joking. Abortion is an extremely hot topic right now, and there is no easy way to solve this issue. But this is perfect for demonstrating my point that this can really help us get through these issues. I'm going to try really hard to give a good faith position from both sides, and to explain the argument from two very grounded and respectable views on abortion. We're going to label them side A and side B, as to not poison the well. I'm going to argue both sides as if I personally believe in them, so that way you can get an accurate view of what someone arguing with you might think about this topic. We'll start with side A. Abortion is legally identical to murder. Terminating a life, regardless of justification, should be illegal. I think anyone would agree with this. Viewing it through the lens of liberalism, we can say that rights granted to each person shall not be infringed even by another person, no matter what the circumstances are, except in the cases of self-defense, which abortion clearly is not, given that the life of the mother is almost never under threat, aside from very rare medical emergencies, so abortion is clearly morally condemnable. Next, we have side B. Abortion is merely a medical procedure. That while yes, it is terminating a life, that life doesn't have the same legal claim to rights as you or I would. Viewing this through the lens of liberalism, we can see that people who are pregnant should have full elective control over their bodies. The government shouldn't be involved in a medical decision between a woman and her doctor. As long as we grant that abortion isn't terminating a legal life, then the government absolutely should have no say in how they proceed with their medical decisions. It's clear that where these two views clash is in the definition of what kind of human life should be granted the rights enumerated in the Constitution. First off, the very concept of life itself is very murky. It's clear that a fetus is a biological organism that will eventually turn into a human, but it doesn't have any of the properties unique to being human until quite a while into development. For the sake of this conversation, I think it's safe to grant that life, while being difficult to objectively define, would almost certainly include the developing offspring of a species. So, I think it's safe to say that life begins at conception. Now, this doesn't really answer the question though, because there are a lot of things that are alive that aren't granted the rights in the Constitution. Even animal rights activists will tell you that they don't want animals to have equal rights to humans, but they think that the rights should be elevated above where they are currently. So it's clear there's a distinction between animals and humans that is important for granting something rights. So we are looking for something that is alive and clearly human. I think it's very safe to say that an offspring of a species that shares the same DNA as its parents should be considered human. So as it stands, things aren't looking very good for side B here. But there's one more key piece of evidence that we need to consider to help us arrive at a decision. Do all humans who are alive get granted the same rights? The answer is counterintuitively no. You see, in the case when people have become officially brain dead, we have their rights transferred to either who they themselves have delegated while they were still alive, or to their next of kin or their family. But does this actually apply in the case of abortion? When someone is brain dead, their body is alive in the same way that a fetus is alive. Their body is performing all of the biological functions necessary to sustain life, while not really having a conscious experience. So we have found it. So the thing that truly matters is not whether someone is just alive and human, but whether that living human has a deployable conscious experience. And when someone is in a state where they don't have access to that, we give the choice of what should happen to them, to their family, or their next of kin. Until a developing fetus has the ability to deploy conscious thought and have a conscious experience, we should delegate its rights to its family members to decide what should happen. And almost obviously in this case that means its mother. And the great part about this resolution is that science actually does give us an answer to this question. The brain begins to show neural activity that is associated with consciousness and being able to deploy a conscious experience around 21 to 24 weeks of gestation. That gives plenty of time before then to notice you're pregnant and to decide whether or not you should have an abortion, while still satisfying most people's common sense view that third trimester abortions should be illegal. And for those who are concerned with the financial reality of having a child, they don't need to be worried about whether their actions are morally condemnable because they aren't terminating something that has the rights in the Constitution as we understand them. The focus should not be on which side you are on or whether this supports the left or the right view more. What's important is the process for how we talked through and got to this answer. We started out with two diametrically opposed views that are extremely emotional about their view. We then tried to figure out exactly where these two views differed and what we were trying to answer. Once we got a good question, we turned to science to see if it had an answer. If it didn't, we went back to the drawing board, and once we figured out a good question to ask, we looked at what current laws there were that were analogous to the situation. We found a good example in current law, and then we were able to turn back to science and actually get a good answer for justifying our beliefs. I'm going to show my hand here a bit because it's obvious that I'm on the left side of things, but I truly believe that reality itself is left-leaning. Meaning that if you do have good faith discussions, stick to the facts, and use secular reasoning, you will come away with a view that is more left-leaning. I will follow up an entire video dedicated to this, but it's why so many people are under the assumption that mainstream media is left-leaning. They are reporting facts, it's just that the facts often line up with left point of views. But in the spirit of Alexander Hamilton, we cannot judge these arguments from our preconceived notions about whether or not I am ideologically compromised. We have to analyze these arguments based on their substance. Where are my facts over feelings crowd? But to try and tie this all back to liberalism, it's important to remember that the conclusions of these topics are not the vital part of this conversation. What's important is that we're focused on the methodology for how we arrived at these views. The same obsession with intellectualism that gave us all the fundamental principles of liberalism can help guide us towards better stances in all aspects of the political spectrum. And another thing I want to stress is that we're not even tied down to the conclusions we come to using this process. We can use the very process we use to come to these conclusions to convince ourselves out of them. That's the beauty of intellectualism. We can use intellectualism to reevaluate the systems that we live in today. We did this already with liberalism, with things like abolishing slavery and giving women the right to vote, and hopefully one day getting everyone to afford healthcare. This should be the prevailing theory of government of this century. It's time to forge a new path forward. It's time for our generation to leave its mark on history. Liberalism should be protected at all costs. It's very important to a society to be free in order to give the best outcomes for all of its citizens. It's important for people to understand that this is no longer a fight of left and right. The fight is liberalism versus fascism, and right now, the fascists are winning. And what makes this conversation extra complicated is that the term liberalism itself has shattered into many sects that completely disagree on what it is or what it should mean. We have an outdated view of liberalism that thinks that the government is some inherently evil structure that wants to enslave its population, and then you have another tainted view of liberalism that sells some of its values for others, like it sells the values of liberty and freedom for the people for other values like economic freedom and the ownership of private property. It's time for us to cut ties with the past, and it's time for a new way forward. Now, I know this was a very long video, and long-winded and very dense, but thank you so much for watching if you did stick around this long, and if you want to continue to join the conversation, feel free to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out my Discord server. I'll have links to them in the description, but mainly use it for having conversations about these kind of things with my friends and other people who want to join. I desperately want to avoid an echo chamber, so if you disagree with me especially, please join the server and we can talk about these things and have discussions about where your views differ from mine and where I could be going wrong. But if you don't feel down for that, then you can always just leave a comment on the video, and I almost definitely will respond to it because yours will likely be the only comment on the video. Also, I just want to mention that I'm setting up a Substack to sort of start on my project of rewriting the Federalist Papers that I talked about in my first video. I'm hoping that project will be done soon. I'm already halfway through the first Federalist paper, and I'll be posting those like maybe once a week, just sort of slowly working through them, trying to rewrite them for modern language and modern times. You can find me on all social media at PottsDavidG, same as my YouTube channel name. That sums up pretty much everything that I wanted to say. So again, thank you for watching, and as always, thank you for your time.